Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. The topic for the webinar is International Relations and Peace Building in South Asia. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Bharat Karnad at La Politique, Department of Political Science, Kirori Mal College, University of Delhi. Mr. Bharat Karnad is a name that needs absolutely no introduction. But just to give a brief view of the plethora of work that he is known for, I would like the audience to know that Mr. Karnad is a distinguished fellow at United Service Institution of India and Emeritus Professor for National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He was a member of the first National Security Advisory Board of India's National Security Council, member of the Nuclear Doctrine Drafting Group, National Security Council, Government of India, and formerly advisor on defense expenditure to the Finance Commission, India. Mr. Karnad holds a BA in Political Science from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Masters in Political Science from University of California, Los Angeles. He is also a well-known author, and some of his books include Why India is Not a Great Power Yet, Staggering Forward Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition. We are thankful to Sir for taking out time for us despite his busy schedule. But before we proceed with the event, let me brief the guidelines for the participants. The participants are requested to stay on mute until asked to unmute. The participants can put up their questions in the chat box, which will be taken up later during the question and answer session. And I would request the participants, if they can switch on their cameras to make the session more interactive, to please do so. I would now like to invite our staff advisor, Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, to introduce the topic to all of us.
The time, I believe, is 6:30 in the morning. Thank you for making time for us, and very warm welcome to the La Politique event, which is organized by the Department of Political Science, Kirori Mal College, University of Delhi, on this very substantive issue and topic of international relations and peace building in the South Asia region. And we're extremely delighted and honored to have you, sir, as a guest speaker for today, and who very kindly accepted our invitation. As Yashasvi referred to, Mr. Karnad is a global expert in the field of national security studies, a very well-known face in the media, and also an author of several books. And I assume the thematics for today's webinar couldn't have been better timed, with Prime Minister Modi landing in USA for 5 days of crucial visit, and to have bilateral meeting with both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, and to discuss and have dialogue on issues of strategic importance. PM Modi is also scheduled to meet Quad leaders, to meet the top business hunters to facilitate global trade. So we are seeing this media already abuzz with covering and analyzing some of the events. And I believe China and Pakistan and other regional powers are doing so, watching very carefully and closely. We're also witnessing the substantial amount of attention and activities in the Southeast Asia region since August 15, 2021. And in the world of complex threats, security and leadership depends on elements of our power, of course, but also on strong and principled diplomacy. A constructive approach to diplomacy doesn't mean relinquishing one's national interest or rights. It actually means engaging with one's counterpart on the basis of equal footing and mutual respect to achieve shared concerns and common goals. So with US withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of engagement, it clearly already appears like a precarious situation in the geostrategic terms and implications. Questions are already being asked about, is there a power vacuum? Is China the next hegemon? Or what are the dynamics which is going to play out in this region? And as we know, so South Asia region is already has the global spotlight just because of the demographics and the territorial geostrategic location of this region. And it's critical for the global peace. So to make us understand and provide a very scholarly insight into how the future of this region looks like, we have with us Mr. Bharat Karnad. Welcome once again, and we are all very eagerly waiting to hear from you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I look forward to this interaction. Um, I think Dr. Oberoi mentioned this being an academic kind of talk by me. It's not. It's more policy oriented. It's what I have always been engaged in, and which perhaps is what you people might want to get an angle on. International relations, by its very nature, is an exercise in avoiding war and promoting peace. That's in theory. But how it works out in practice is that it is an exercise in the balance of power, whether at the sub-regional, regional, extended regional, continental, and the global levels. So, for there to be world peace that everybody hankers for, you have to have this kind of balance at all these various levels at all time. This is very difficult to maintain. That's why we have wars and conflicts, acts of sabotage and military hostilities generally all over the world at any given time. So this is, in fact, a very difficult system to upkeep. And that's where I think diplomacy and the work of the various foreign offices and chancelleries the world over comes into the picture. Um, because our focus is South Asia and how to go about fostering peace, especially between India and Pakistan, let's start out with some very basic elements about India's posture. It is very unfortunate that, we do not have, from India's point of view, we do not have a pacified neighborhood. This is the first step for any big country to aspire to become a great power. This we have unfortunately not achieved or accomplished because we have very tense and strained relations with just about every neighbor you can think of, short of Bhutan. And even there, even though it is nominally a protectorate of India, even there are now sections in Bhutanese society who would like to play off, as other neighbors are doing, the Chinese against the Indians, New Delhi against Beijing, to extort the best possible benefits for themselves, maximize the benefits, maximize the leverage that they have vis-a-vis Beijing and New Delhi. So we are now in a situation where we have to juggle many balls, as it were. There are so many balls that are up in the air that we cannot drop, that it becomes a very testy exercise in the best of times. So this is what we are dealing with. You might consider it a very complex juggling act, as it were. It's not a simple thing, and there are bound to be failures. There are bound to be, and you'll meet with an occasional success. Success is rarer than failure because of the complexity of the task that governments confront all over. It's not just the Indian government. Every government confronts these kinds of conditions and situations. Now, starting with something that recent development, geopolitical development that you may have an inkling of, the Australia-UK US military alliance that was just announced a few days back. Let's start with that because that's the cutting edge as far as the American establishment is concerned to confront China. Now, what does that do to the so-called quadrilateral we were engaged in? The quadrilateral was originally conceived by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007, and he called it the security diamond, comprising India, US, Japan, and Australia. But with Australia going off with US and UK in a far more, shall we say, a hefty military alliance, especially now with the Americans also transferring to Australia nuclear submarines and production expertise as well. They'll be able to produce something like 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, able to fire Tomahawk long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, which means that the Chinese military moves to say invade China, for instance, will be immediately thwarted, will be frustrated by the very act of the Australian Navy now having sea denial capabilities with these very powerful lethal platforms in the Taiwan Straits or off the Taiwan Straits. So this is the kind of maneuvering that's going to take place to militarily checkmate each other. Now, even as we're talking about AUKUS, this new military alliance coming into being, you have now reports of the Chinese Navy sending off their warships, a flotilla of 3 warships to the Aleutian Islands, the American, exclusive economic zone, into the exclusive economic zone. And the pattern obviously is that they'll reciprocate in the same manner as the Americans do, meaning if they do not respect their coastal waters that the Chinese consider their sphere of influence, then the Chinese will send their ships to the American West Coast or wherever they want to. It's a very long coastline for them to register in the same manner their presence in American waters or in the extended American waters. So this is the sort of checkmate, balancing, counterbalancing that we are going to see. Where India is concerned, I'm afraid what has happened with the Quadrilateral is that with AUKUS coming into the picture, the Quadrilateral gets shifted to the background. It's necessarily going to be a secondary alliance, and India will have to wonder and have to consider and do a rethink about whether we want to be a supportive mechanism to AUKUS, or do we want to have an independent status and standing and have our own military architecture for our security that addresses Asian concerns, the protection of Asian states by Asian states and Asian militaries. And for a very long time now, almost 20 years, I've been suggesting that this is the situation we're going to get to, and we are now there, which essentially means that the traditional Anglo-Saxon powers that have always dominated modern history anyway, are now are making separate arrangements. You will see that AUKUS even cuts out traditional American allies like Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, which was a treaty ally. They of course redrew their arrangement and treaty alliance structure, etc. But the point I'm trying to make is that if this is going to be an Anglo-Saxon kind of congeries of power versus states that are organic to Asia looking after their own security, then we can be no part of the Quadrilateral as has been envisaged, because there again the US plays a central part. But because the US has now opted for AUKUS as the cutting edge, we'd have to reconsider our options. And our options, as I always maintained, I elaborate in my books, is you have the Quadrilateral. I've called it the Mod Quad, modified Quadrilateral of India, Japan. Instead of America, you have bring in Taiwan formally into the picture, and instead of the Southeast Asian group of nations substituting for Australia. Which are the Southeast Asian groups that are militarily capable and are rich enough to maintain a fairly weighty kind of military capability? You have Singapore. Vietnam is perhaps the finest fighting power you have in Asia, far more than India. If you recall its history, the Vietnamese people have beaten just about every power you can think of in the 21st century, the 20th century. And it does not take any nonsense from anybody. They have talked about a 1,000-year war with China. And they've said this in the year 8000 AD. So 800 AD, so sorry. From 800 AD onwards, the Vietnamese have sought to establish and assert their separate independence. So Vietnam is a very, very important partner for India to cultivate and have in this modified Quadrilateral that I've talked about, the Mod Quad. And this is what is necessary for India to develop. because this is a model of organic security. Why organic? Organic because it involves only states within the region who look after their own security interests and protect themselves the best they can. When you have extraterritorial powers like the United States or Russia or anybody else, then because of their power and their capabilities, these very large, great powers or superpowers begin to take the trust and the attention and the focus of any alliance they are in to their own interests, to support their interests, not the interests and the security of the lesser states in the alliance. And whether we like it or not, India is the lesser state in the traditional quadrilateral we are talking about. And therefore, we ought to really fashion and configure a system where we have a very large say, a large role. And that's why the mod quad. Now, why is it that, well, one of the real problems with India getting, in a sense, stabilizing the region we are in is our enmity, traditional enmity with Pakistan. This has been an unfortunate fallout of partition and the partition pathologies that have followed in train. And we haven't, 70 years after the event, quite reconciled to each other yet, which is a pity, really, because in a very real sense, the Pakistani culture is no different from Indian culture. If you go to Pakistan, if any of you have the opportunity to do so, you should. You'll discover that the entire culture is centered in India, in terms of Indian cultural devices, artifacts, institutions. Even if you take the Islamic, the jihadi elements, what is the seminary that talks of jihad in the religious sense? It's the Deoband, seminary in Uttar Pradesh, in Deoband. So you have the religious center in India for a country that talks of itself as a theocratic state, a country that was founded on the basis of a single religion. But its center, its learning, locus of its learning, Islamic learning, are all in India. Loci, whether it's Deoband, it's Barelvi, they're all in India. Most of the major historic artifacts are in India that are supposedly, quote, Islamic, and so on and so forth. So in a very real sense, for the Pakistanis, they face a harsh reality, which is that they have no independent existence in terms of historic antecedents, because they're Indian, in the sense that the larger sphere is the Indian sphere, Indic sphere. And therefore, they really are stuck with having to reconcile contradictions, which is their business. How they do it, and whether they succeed or not, is really their business. But when we make it our business to discomfort them as a larger power, we have to see how is it that we can get around the enmity, get around the animus that they have felt for India, because they believe that we are out, India is out to dismantle Pakistan, to undo partition, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, there are sections within Indian society with their rhetoric more than anything else, and with their actions in the provincial kind of ways, which in a sense confirm these biases that the Pakistani state has, Pakistani people have about India. Now, the question is, how do you outflank these biases? And I always said that, look, when we talk of Pakistan as a threat, what it ends up doing over time is to belittle India, because India is so much larger. So when Indian government talks of threat from Pakistan, you end up destroying your own credibility in the outside world. Because the outside world sees what is objectively are the facts. Look at the Pakistani economy. Its GDP is right now, I think, around 1/13 of the market cap of the Mumbai Stock Exchange, for God's sake, right? It is so minuscule. It's and our, and their entire budget is about the equal or less than our defense budget, the entire budget of Pakistan. So when we talk of Pakistan and we get worked up about Pakistan being a threat and this, that, and the other, we end up destroying our credibility as a nation. Our perceptions then come into question. And which is what I've said for 30 years. We end up destroying our status and posture when we make China, Pakistan our major concern, a major security concern. True, they, as a weak power, like any weak power, they are using whatever means they have at their command. And terrorism, as many of you know, is a weapon of the weak. It's not the weapon of the strong, it's the weapon of the weak. Now, and that's why you have, say, Hezbollah going up against Israeli state, which is very, very powerful. That's why you have the East Turkestan Liberation Movement fighting for the freedom of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang in China. And you have all these various ethnic freedom fighters, you see, trying to assert themselves all over the world. And therefore, in the subcontinent, really, it is India's call. How do we want the future to be? Can we, in some ways, encompass Pakistan in a larger South Asian co-prosperity sphere? This is what we have to begin to think of in the future. We cannot maintain the kind of the kind of hostile relations, mutually hostile relations that we have done over the last 70 years, because what it'll do is really destroy Pakistan, of course, because the more they shall we say, divert their monies, their very scarce monies, to the cause of defense, the less they'll have for development. The more, therefore, the society becomes vulnerable to Islamist extremism. And you see the problem that could create for India. Because India is now, and by 2030, will be the largest Muslim country in the world. It's not Pakistan. Pakistan is a rump state. Will be surpassing Indonesia as the largest Muslim country in the world, as will be the largest Hindu country in the world, as will be larger, unless all Chinese turn Buddhist, will also be the largest Buddhist country in the world, or something like that. Maybe that's not quite correct, but you can check up the statistics. The point I'm trying to make is very simple. We cannot afford to victimize ourselves by being constrained within our religious identity, right? I mean, faith, religion is a personal faith. You're free to keep it, whatever it is. Now, when that is projected to the power of the state, and the state subsumes a religious identity, is when you have problems, which is what's happening with Pakistan and why it is destroying itself from the inside. Because once you have, say, in the case of Pakistan, you have a Muslim Islamic state founded on the base of Islam, then you'll begin differentiating not on the basis of, like in other democracies, regions, castes, or whatever it is, the political arithmetic, domestic arithmetic, but in terms of how theocratically and religiously pure you are, pure in terms of religious tenets. So in Pakistan, the normal secular sections are always outmaneuvered and trumped by the extremist element. So this is what is not only poses a threat to India, but it not only poses a threat to Pakistan, but to India. And that's why I've said the best thing we can do is to ensure that Pakistan is a stable state and help it in any way we can. That is the long view we should have. Why I've been advocating, unfortunately, against the grain of government policies, that it's in our interest to have a strong and stable Pakistan and not to undermine it at every turn. Because the fallout will be bad and it'll be on India. We will have to face the problems. And as I've dilated elsewhere at great length in my books, if Pakistan did not exist, we would have to invent it, because Pakistan serves a very good purpose in a strategic sense for India. It is a strategic cordon sanitaire uh, that acts as a buffer between, say, the Islamic elements and influences from west of Pakistan that have now come into Pakistan, right? Because extremist Islam was never part of the subcontinental Islam. It never was. Now, this is the foreign element that has come in and has infected the body politic in Pakistan and is in some sense dictating India's policies, which is really counterproductive from India's national interest point of view. That said, what can India do in this situation where we face enormous complexities and the kind of Pakistan that we have, not what we would wish for. The Pakistan we have to deal with is what is there across the border, with all its problems, with all its weaknesses, with all its infirmities. This is the Pakistan we face, and therefore, this is what we have. Whatever we have to do, we have to try and improve that situation for our own sake, not for Pakistan's sake, for our own sake, for our own stability, for our own security. Now, one of my pet themes is, and has been for many, many years, the possibility of India. As I've said, I've talked about the South Asian co-prosperity sphere, which really is a takeoff on what the Japanese had in mind when they talked about the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. But they meant to do it through imperial means by establishing an empire that throughout the British, while they took over the British regions, and that was the reason for the Second World War and so on. But in our case, I've been pleading and making the case for, shall we say, demilitarizing the Western border. Now consider, people throw up their hands and say, oh my, what would that mean? Well, very simple. I've said, and when I talk to our military audiences and foreign audiences as well, I've said that what would happen if the Indian government decided tomorrow, say, to withdraw its main field armies from the Western border? What can Pakistan do? What will Pakistan do? They're in no position to do anything. If anything, they'll be so perplexed, they'll be nonplussed into inaction. Because as it is, they maintain that we are out to undo partition. Undo the partition, we mean them ill, this, that, and the other. If we go out and completely take out our field armies from the Western border and use our military assets to deal with China, which has always been the principal threat and is the most lethal, complex threat we are right now in no position to handle, very honestly speaking. We are not in a position adequately to handle the Chinese threat across the Himalayas, across the line of actual control, the disputed border. So we are diverting our assets, our resources, to dealing with a minor foe when the most serious threat is looming right there. Is right there in Ladakh, is right there across the central sector, is right there in Arunachal Pradesh, across the Sikkim borders and so on, across the 4,700 kilometer line of actual control. And when we assume Chinese to be peaceful, look what happened. We had Ladakh, aggression in eastern Ladakh. So while we are concentrating on Pakistan, the Chinese have been very surely and very steadfastly occupying and grabbing our territory, because we are not mindful of the loss that we are taking from the Chinese, because we are so focused on China. This is a ridiculous situation we've gotten ourselves into. Also because our military is Pakistan fixated, which is why we have 3 strike corps, armored strike corps, completely inappropriate force structure for India, considering that China is the main threat. So if you do what I've said, demilitarize the western border, and I've asked for something else, starting from when I was on the National Security Advisory Board, and I was part of the group drafting the nuclear doctrine, and ever since then, our nuclear forces, strategic forces, our rocket forces are being trained in this idiom, which is that, oh, well, we espy a nuclear threat from Pakistan. For God's sake, if Pakistan is not a conventional threat, how can it be a nuclear threat? Yes, there can be a nuclear threat if the nuclear weapons that the Pakistani forces have are somehow leaked to the Islamist elements, extremists, that are inimical, that act inimical to Indian interests, in which case we have a real problem, which is what we have to avoid. The reason we have to stabilize Pakistan is precisely this, the possibility that a jihadi takeover of the Pakistan state and establishment will place nuclear weapons in their hands. And because they are working to achieve Jannat or whatever, the paradise that they're all harking for through jihad, they're quite happy to be incinerated, vaporized in a nuclear war, while more secular and rational people would say, hey, that is not an option that we ought to be considering. So this is the kind of dilemmas we all face. We face in particular when dealing with Pakistan. So I've said, and I've been recommending, that we also take out all and very publicly make a show of taking off all redeploying our nuclear missiles, the Agni 5 missiles in particular, the short range and medium range Agni 7s, Agni 1s, 3s, and so on, to the Chinese border entirely, because they're the main threat. They are a strategic threat. They are an existential threat to India. Pakistan is not, can never be, was never, is not now, can never be an existential threat to India. But India can be perceived as an existential threat to Pakistan because of its sheer size, because of the sheer disparity of resources. And so we have to, in some sense, try and blunt the Pakistani perceptions of India as a state that really does not mean it harm, that we would really like to work with them. And then once you do take these kinds of military actions, then the next thing would be to say, okay, fine. We offer to all neighboring countries, all the adjoining countries adjoining India, we offer you all free access to the Indian market. You can sell your commodities here in India, free of all custom duties, free completely. As long as what the commodities and the products are produced in your country fully. So you don't have Chinese coming in and having some small little setup in Pakistan that will market as a made in Pakistan goods and then on pass it to Indian markets. No, we should make it clear that this benefit will accrue to only those elements in adjoining societies, economic entities that you want to benefit from accessing the Indian market. And the Indian market is very, very strong. People don't realize the leverage we have, the economic leverage. And that's the reason why just about everybody wants access to the Indian market, do they not? That is the leverage we have, which we need to use to, first of all, pacify the neighborhood. China doesn't need to be pacified with an open market access. We have to use that leverage to stop the Chinese from acting in a manner that they do, to undermine our interests. But we can use it to encompass, draw in Pakistan, draw in Nepal. Nepal is already very much connected to the Indian economy and the free market of, free flow of labor, etc. Bangladesh is getting into that thing, which is a very good thing to happen. But Sri Lanka, we have alienated Sri Lanka. And they desperately want to have leverage both with Delhi and Beijing, but do not want to be too much in the Chinese lap. So we have to work on those sentiments in the adjoining states, in the Maldives. But you'll have very singular success with all the adjoining states if you have success with Pakistan. See the point? Pakistan then becomes central to having a pacified South Asian neighborhood in which India will be the fulcrum, will be the economic nodal power. Because Pakistan cannot be that, and Sri Lanka cannot be that. While all these adjoining countries are connected to India, they are not connected to each other. That's the central geostrategic and geographical fact of life that everybody in the neighborhood would have to deal with and reconcile to, and which also in a sense shows us the way forward about how peace can be obtained. Peace cannot be obtained by bilateral negotiations. There are limitations on how far you can go with these kinds of things that we have indulged in for the last 70 years. Purely diplomatic channels. We have to use our economic resources and might. The lure and temptation of the Indian market has to be used. The entrepreneurial genius of the Indian and Indian talent has to be used to draw in these countries, to have us all collectively prosper. Why? Because then you have a unitary strategic space that you obtain this way to deal with China. Then China cannot play off Pakistan against us. China will not be able to play off Sri Lanka against us. They will not be able to use sections of the Bhutanese court against us. They'll not be able to, compromise elements in the Nepalese government again and use them against us. This is what will happen. This is the larger kind of scenario that we have to work towards. And I don't think there's any way out. There's no military solution to it, but there is an economic solution. You open up the borders to cultural, toing and froing. There could be such a renaissance every which way, which then will free the Indian government to concentrate our resources against the real danger, the real threat, the substantive threat that is posed by China. Not just to India, to all South Asia. And by all South Asia, I also mean an extended Southern Asia, which would necessarily include Afghanistan, which would include the Central Asian states, because all these areas were at one time connected in a very umbilical way to India, were they not? I mean, the Mughals came from the Fargana Valley in Central Asia. Now, we have to reconnect in some sense with our past, with countries in our past, to make for a far better future. While this may sound idyllic, it is not. It is commonsensical and workable solution to getting what we want. We can beat our head against the wall and keep relying on military means to subdue Pakistan, and you will fail because they have, first of all, they have Chinese patronage, and China will ensure that Pakistan never sinks. Let's be very clear about that. It'll give it economic, military, whatever help and assistance Pakistan needs at any given time to keep it afloat as a separate entity, which is what we seem not to really appreciate. So, and because China is China, we have to begin doing to China what they've been doing to us. Meaning that if they're using Pakistan against us, why have we not used Taiwan against China? Why have we not used Vietnam against China? Vietnam has beaten and bludgeoned Chinese militarily in 1979 when the Chinese dared intrude into northern Vietnam, and they were beaten back in black and blue. So this is, I somehow suspect that, and I'll end on this note. I'm sorry, I think I'm just reaching the 40-minute level. I think our problem has been that we have concentrated on the wrong front, our resources, our government's attention and focus, and let China off virtually scot-free. And the Chinese have taken full advantage of it. Our fixation, our idée fixe, which is Pakistan, which really is, for me, it actually makes no sense, because by any metric of power, Pakistan is not a threat, so not a threat, can never be a threat, that it is almost ridiculous, which really, as I've said, destroys our credibility and reduces us. By the way, which also means the Pakistan for the Pakistanis, when we reduce ourselves to making Pakistan a threat, their stock goes up in the world, does not. Their foreign policy success is precisely that India considers Pakistan a threat, which is really a joke. And therefore, we have to get our bearings right. We have to know who our adversary really is, and that's China, but not rely on outside powers. We tend so easily to do that. We think that the US cavalry is going to ride to your rescue. No, nobody is going to come to your rescue. They're interested in protecting their own interests, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad or anything else. We have to worry and be concerned and work for our interests in our own way, and have a military that addresses these concerns. Thank you. Maybe
So
now we can get into
Arya, to take on and formally thank you, sir, for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank you.
Yes. So Arya, take it over.
A very cheerful morning to Mr. Karnad, and good evening to Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, my fellow mates, and all the participants. I, Arya Prasad, on behalf of the La Politique, Department of Political Science, Kirori Mal College, University of Delhi, present you a hearty vote of thanks for bestowing your precious insights and gracing and enlightening us with your versatile experience, your findings and submissions. It just wouldn't have been possible for us to have such an comprehensive experience without the global and universal experience of yours. So we are very thankful to you. And I'd like to also extend my thanks to Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, the staff advisor for La Politique, for her untiring cooperation and continuous support in organizing the event. Last but not the least, I thank the entire La Politique team for organizing this event in such a short notice of time. And I thank all the participants for their active discussion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.